Hi students, welcome to week 7. This week we're going to be looking at the I-novel in a little bit more detail, but we're going to be looking at it from a different perspective. So last week was pretty hectic for you. You got assignment 1 completed, which is wonderful. And in doing so, you might have felt that you got a little bit behind on some of the material that we were working on. So let's just kind of go over what we did. We looked at Futon by Katai Teyama. And obviously this is a novel published in 1907, so it's very, very early, very, very modernist. And it's what we call an I-novel. It really is the first proper example of the I-novel. There are several other titles that compete in terms of being the first I-novel. And that might be something that you look into for assignment 2, which I'm going to give you more info on. So in terms of the I-novel then, the I-novel is this very highly subjective novel form. Shoshusetsu is the Japanese name for it. And it was popularized in Japan in the early 1900s. So around about from kind of 1907 into the 1920s, this was a very, very popular genre. Now, again, if you think about it, the I-novel is still popular. We just don't call them I-novels anymore. Narrating in the first person is something that most novels, or many novels, actually do now. But remember, back in the early 20th century, it wasn't actually a very popular mode of narration. Why? Because Victorian and European traditions dictated that we had to narrate in a kind of detached manner. Hence, we have third-person narration. You know, he, she, they. I, of course, is first person. So it's that deeper, more subjective look into a novel. Now, last week we looked at Futon, which I'm sure you'll agree is a kind of fairly disturbing text in its own way. Remember, if we are going to say a text is disturbing, call it disturbing. Don't call it dark. Dark is a very modern word for texts that just wasn't around in the period in which these Japanese novels were published. And it also doesn't translate into Japanese at all. So disturbing is always a better term. Now, if you didn't have time to read the 2 critical essays that came with that wonderful Futon novel, and if you didn't have time to properly read through Futon, first thing you need to be doing this week is going over Futon and then reading those 2 critical essays and making copious notes. Now this week, you're going to complement that reading by reading a very different novel. It's actually very similar, but it's very different because the aims are totally different. Whereas Katai Teyama aims to create a novel that was deliberately subjective, it blurs the boundaries between that third-person narration and the first-person narration. And we really do get a sense into the kind of disturbed, lovesick mind of our narrator as he kind of pines after this young woman. What we actually see with the next novel that you're looking at is it's a parody. It's a parody novel, so it's parodying the I-novel genre. So you can read these 2. You can read In Black and White, which is this week's reading. And again, if you just look on the PowerPoint, I've got all of your readings for this week. This week, you're going to be looking at the extracts from In Black and White by Junichiro Tanizaki. Now, this name should ring a bell. If you remember, you looked at Tanizaki's work in week 1. You looked at The Tattooer. Do you remember that wonderful story about the spider tattoo that kind of became real? It's very similar to that vein. Now, if you think about it, The Tattooer came out in 1910. Again, it's that very sort of experimental modernist era, coming from the Taisho era, late Meiji Taisho. If you think about In Black and White came out in 1928. So that's 18 years later. So things are going to have changed by then. Modernism's going to be on the wane, which it was. And people, writers, authors, artists even, are going to start to parody the very tendencies that were once popular. So if you look at Futon by Katai Teyama, and then you look at In Black and White by Junichiro Tanizaki, what you will see is that you have one book which is very earnestly I-novel, Shoshusetsu, and then you have the second book, which it still contains elements of the I-novel. It is an I-novel, but it's self-consciously an I-novel. There's parody moments. It's a detective novel, and there are so many moments of parody in it that they're kind of, you can barely count them. But the extracts that I've selected for you are especially key in showing that parody. Now, you need to read the extracts, they're in your course pack. And then I also want you to read what's called the translator's afterword to In Black and White. The translator was a woman called Phyllis Lyons, and she actually only recently, 2 years ago, published a new translated version of In Black and White. She translated it obviously from Japanese to English. And she gives this fascinating account of her translation in the afterword. You will definitely be using this, I think, probably, if you focus on the iNovel for either assignment 2 or assignment 3. You also need to read your second critical reading, which is Sadami Suzuki. Again, you recognize this critic. This is somebody who you looked at last week. So Sadami Suzuki's Junichiro Tanizaki as cultural critic. Now, you need to think about how Tanizaki's In Black and White is a critical piece. How is it a parody? One of the ways to think about this is to think about the more general ways in which Tanizaki operates as a cultural critic. Now, cultural critic's just some fancy academic term for somebody who criticizes culture or has an opinion on it. You're all cultural critics, you're modern day cultural critics. So Tanizaki was a cultural critic in the 1920s in Japan. So have a think, what's he criticizing? Is he criticizing the iNovel genre? Is he criticizing the politics of Western and increasingly westernized Japan in the 1920s? Is he criticizing his narrator? Is he criticizing male treatment of women? And again, these are all questions that you'll have to ask yourself as you read those extracts from the novel. I'm not having you read the whole novel. I think after last week with the assignment 1, you've done quite enough. And you might be relieved to know that next week we don't actually have any more new reading and we don't have a lecture. You are just going to be drafting assignment 2. That's purely what you're going to be doing, okay? So this week then, you're going to be looking at Junichiro Tanizaki's In Black and White, the extracts. And again, I do hope you really enjoy this. This is a mysterious, creepy, weird novel. Sit down to your course pack, maybe pour a cup of tea or coffee, maybe wait until it's late at night for the full atmosphere and just kind of read this weird little text. Then I'd like you to look at the translators afterward. In fact, you might want to do that before, just to kind of get an idea of how the text has actually been translated. And then you're going to look at Sadami Suzuki's Junichiro Tanizaki as cultural critic. This was published in Japan Forum. It was actually published about, I think, 24 years ago, 1996. So quite an old piece of secondary criticism, but nonetheless a good one. Okay, and again, the link to that all in your course pack. So those are your readings. Let's have a little bit of a look. If you go through the rest of the PowerPoint, you'll see that I've given some context on In Black and White. It narrates the story of a novelist who inadvertently frames himself for murder when he accidentally predicts a man's death. There's definitely elements of comedy, by the way, in the iNovel. And again, that would make a really good topic for assignment 2. To what extent does the iNovel blur different genres, comedy, tragedy, parody, the detective novel as a genre? So that could be something you look at. Let's have a look at the next slide. So again, thinking about the parody on the kind of oversharing, superlative, almost that sense of being too much. These qualities of the iNovel meant that it was rich for parody, and that's what Tanizaki is doing here. Also think about the idea of subjective writing as a whole. If you look at the extracts from page 208 to 209, have a look at this extract. I'm going to read it to you. This is from In Black and White. So this is a conversation that you'll kind of work out who it's between when you read. But I'd say that there are 2 types of writers. One who hides himself completely when he writes, and one who wants to be writing himself. Not that he doesn't write about people other than himself, but who ultimately is explaining himself. Whatever he writes, in a word, what we might call the objective writer and the subjective writer, Well then, Mr. Mizuno, what type are you? He's asked. He says, I believe myself to be the subjective type. Of course he does. He's writing an iNovel, or at least a parody of one. Mr. Mizuno is our central character. So that means that your story, To the Point of Murder, this is the story that our central protagonist has written, in which he's unwittingly predicted somebody's death. So he says, so that means that your story, To the Point of Murder, represents your own state of mind. This is one of the leading criticisms of the iNovel. Did it represent the author's state of mind? People would confuse the author, so Kataitayama. They would often wonder, is this novel about him? And of course, we know from his obsession, we're talking about Futon, of course, we know from his obsession with the young woman who moved into his house that he had, that he did base the I-novel off his own life. So this is kind of where Tanizaki is parodying that tendency by saying, well, actually, what's the difference between the I-novel's central protagonist and the narrator and the author? Are they all one and the same? So the detective here says to him, well then, Mr. Mizuno, what type are you? He says, I believe myself to be the subjective type of writer. So that means that your story to the point of murder represents your own state of mind. Absolutely, Mizuno replies. And that's really interesting. So our narrator here is almost admitting the link between the I-novel and it being the words of the author. There's that conflation. Now, of course, the author here is Mr. Mizuno. He's the author of the story. But also we can read this in as Tanizaki having a bit of a joke. Is this particular in black and white, is it about Tanizaki or his life? Not at all. There's no link whatsoever. Tanizaki was never arrested for murder. He didn't kill anybody. He didn't write stories about murder generally. So there's no link at all. But he's parodying the idea that there can be, because of course with earlier authors like Tayama Katai, we do have that link between the author and their text. So if you look at page 211 as well, there's lots and lots of stuff about the idea of truth. And I think that can definitely bear into a narrative. How do we define what's true in a narrative? How do we define what's false? So these are questions to think about. Another thing to consider, if you have a look on the slide 7, the author's apology on the conclusion. This is a really overt satire on the overly apologetic, friendly tone of the author in the I-novel genre. So this is Tanizaki reflecting on that and having a big joke about it. See if you think the same when you read it. So that's your reading that I'd like you to do this week. And once you've read the critical essays by Suzuki and also the translators afterward, I think you'll have a better idea of what the text is about and what its aims are. Now, you can also start to think about how the I-novel connects to other things that we've looked at. Romanticism, realism, subjective writing. These are all things we talked about in week 1. So you might want to go back to that and look again at these. How does Tanizaki relate to these traditions? Now, all of you realised in your videos that Tanizaki's work represents the modernist, most experimental form of early Japanese writing. It wasn't really naturalist in many elements. There were naturalist parts, but it tended to be more experimental. I mean, what's naturalist about a giant spider tattoo becoming real and taking over somebody? Not much. So Tanizaki was well on his way to the more experimental traditions of the I-novel in the 1910s when he wrote The Tattooer. But by the time we get to this novel in black and white, he's over those traditions. This is a parody of those intently subjective, very deep, very panicked feelings of our narrator. We really do see an evolution of that style. And it's more overt in its parody of the I-novel and those sorts of overly subjective, unnaturalistic traditions. Now, there isn't really anything naturalistic about in black and white either. It's not really natural that we're arrested for murder every day, but there is some naturalistic element. If you look at the dialogue between the detective and the accused, very naturalistic, very realistic. If you look at the overall description of events, again, it's very realistic. It is very intense and it is very personal, like the I-novel. But again, Tanizaki often employs those qualities as a parody, as a joke, to parody those conventions. So assignment 2 then, moving on, I'm sure you're already still exhausted from assignment 1. I'd like you to look at the assignment brief first, because when you look at that, you really will have a better idea. But in a nutshell, assignment 2 asks you to create an annotated bibliography of existing research that you do into a topic. Now, you've got quite a few weeks to do that. I'm just going to get your due date up on the syllabus. If you look at your syllabus, you will see that assignment 2 is not due until the end of week 10. We're in week 7, so you've got week 7, 8, 9, 10. That's a month. Your aim is to read 10 critical essays or chapters from a scholarly, university press published book, and that's really important. You don't want to just be reading any old trollop of a book. It's got to be proper. It's got to be scholarly. Of course it has. And the journal articles have got to be peer reviewed. You're going to read 10 of those. And it can be ones that you've already read on this course. That's absolutely fine. I'd like you to do that, in fact. And you're going to write a little kind of research report on your reading. The assignment brief tells you how to construct the report. So for more details, go to the assignment brief. And that's what I'd like you to start on this week. Now, I'm sure you've got a bunch of questions about this, but I'm not going to outline them all here. Go to the assignment brief, have a read through, and I think I pretty much kind of outline every question that you might have. You do have a template that you need to use for this assignment. This is because what I don't want is for somebody to decide, oh, I'm going to write an essay about my 10 readings. I don't want an essay. I want you to produce your assignment in a very specific format. And for this, you are going to need to use, you're going to have a citation, so an MLA citation, a summary, and this is kind of a main summary of what the article's about, the article or book chapter. Then you're going to have a reflection. So how is this article relevant to your topic? And then you're going to have your quotables. Now, of course, the first question I normally get is, well, what's my topic? Your topic could be anything. It could be the subjection of women in writing from Japan. It could be the I-novel genre. You could maybe have a certain claim or argument or hypothesis about that. I do have a few topic selections on the assignment brief, so have a look at those. But in general, that's pretty much it. That's all I really need you to do for this week. Read over the material and start to draft assignment 2. Any questions? I'm always here, as usual. You know where I am. Okay? That's pretty much it. Thanks very much for listening, and if you do need me, let me know. Okay?